Only Cows and Horses by Charlotte Walters. Chapter 1. Harriet was getting quite used to staring down the barrel of a shotgun. It was the preferred method used by traditional Dales farmers when trying to remove someone unwelcome from their land, and a female veterinarian was seldom welcome. So, as the weather-beaten old man took aim, she calmly waggled her finger at him as if he was a naughty child attempting to steal sweets, rather than a cranky adult threatening to shoot her for just trying to do her job. "I can assure you that I am a fully qualified veterinarian, and shooting me won't be necessary," she asserted, determined to stand her ground. As he pulled back the trigger, the piece of string holding up his trousers came loose, causing the waistband to slip down under his protruding belly. Harry suddenly got an excellent view of his hairy belly button. "And I can assure thee, veterinary, I'll shoot you if you don't get off my land. Don't want no lass treating me animals, telling me what's out and out." The trousers slipped even further, threatening to expose far worse than just a belly button. Harry became distracted by the unwelcome sight of the top of his long johns, and was actually quite lost for words. He took full advantage of this and continued his rant, shaking his shotgun and saying things she had heard 100 times before from farmers all over the North Yorkshire Dales since her arrival just over a month ago. The angrier he got, the lower the trousers became, until eventually the inevitable happened. They fell to his ankles, exposing the full glory of his stained old long johns and knee-high socks. Now he was completely thrown as to which he should be most worried about, the existence of a female veterinary surgeon, or the fact that he was exposing himself to one. After a few seconds of thought and a vigorous chew of his pipe, old Mortimer decided that nothing, even flashing your undergarments at relative strangers, was as bad as a woman thinking she could be a veterinarian. And to emphasize his point, he suddenly sent a spray of pellets whistling into the air above Harry's head. Her much-tested resolve kicked in, and she put her hands on her hips in defiance. She didn't spend all those years struggling through veterinary college to give up now. And besides, these curmudgeonly old men needed to start moving with the times. "You miss me by a country mile, Mr. Mortimer, and if that was meant to scare me, it didn't work. Your underwear, on the other hand. Now, I might not be a local or a man, but I'm a better veterinarian than you'll ever be a marksman, thank goodness. So why don't you just let me treat the patient and I'll be on my way? And please, pull your trousers up. I'd say that I don't want to see tomorrow's washing, but those don't look like they've been washed in years." His mouth gaped open so wide that his pipe fell out and stuck in the snow. Harry opened the back of her Morris Traveller and got out her black bag. Mortimer shuffled over, holding his trousers with one hand and pointing the shotgun at her with the other. "What do you think you're doing? You won't be treating no animal of mine. Come in here, taking off work of them that need it. Young lads, born and bred here, you should be ashamed. This is no work for a lassie that's final." Reluctantly, Harry resorted to the only weapon in her armoury, the one thing that always changed their minds. "I'd treat your bull for free, no charge, Mr. Mortimer." Suddenly, the transformative powers of saving brass kicked in, and Harry could see by his expression that her bullet had found its target. Mortimer retrieved his pipe from the snow, shoved it in his mouth, and had a good, thoughtful chew. "Free, you say? Charge me nowt?" "Absolutely nowt, Mr. Mortimer." There was a tense silence as he considered Harry's proposition. She stood her ground, knowing that somewhere on this farm was an animal suffering, a beast that wouldn't care what sex she was as long as she could help. Unlike people, animals were devoid of prejudice, and this was one of the many things that Harry loved about them. She often felt that she preferred animals to people, found them easier to understand, more straightforward and rewarding, less likely to shoot you. After giving it some thought, Mortimer let out a deep sigh of resignation. "You best follow me, then," he said, turning towards the briar and finally lowering the shotgun. This should have felt like a victory for Harri, but all she actually felt was frustration over the time they had wasted. Eager to finally do her job, she started to follow and couldn't help but smile as he jiggled his ample backside into the seat of his trousers. But the unhappy truth was that these small-minded attitudes were costing her the very last of her precious savings. Every time she offered to treat an animal for free, she had to pay the bill herself, so that her boss at the practice wouldn't realize yet another farmer had refused to let her treat his livestock. Sterling Ross had given her 9 unpaid months to prove herself and to show that the great and good of Farnborough's farming community would accept her. She was desperate to hide from him the extent to which she was failing. Harri reached into the snow and retrieved Mortimer's string. "Oh, and Mr. Mortimer, I think you'll be needing this. If only you were as careful about saving your dignity as you are about your brass, then I wouldn't have the memory of your underwear to try and forget." The snow was falling heavily now, big fat flakes swirling in the bitterly cold wind. Mortimer pulled his scarf up over his chin, having the advantage of sparing Harri the worst of his awful breath. "And I ain't a bad shot, by the way," he grumbled, snatching the string closely. "I weren't actually aiming at you, not really, not this time."
"Oh, well then, that's fine. I'm glad we cleared that up,"
Harri retorted sarcastically as he searched his trousers.
"Now then, this underweight bull, how long has he been showing symptoms?"
she added as they approached the briar door. Mortimer pulled the door open, and inside Harri had her first glimpse of the patient. He was a large Aberdeen Angus bull, angrily snorting and scraping his back hoof as a scrawny young lad, who looked terrified, but did his best to restrain him with a length of rope and a stick.
"I said it were no job for the lass,"
Mortimer said smugly as the beast shook his head and almost threw the lad to the floor.
"Get on with you, you big old sod!"
he shouted at the bull from the safety of just outside the door, backing away just in case. He put his hand on Harri's shoulder and gave it a good pat.
"Get on with it then, in you go. You said you was perfectly capable."
He had a wicked twinkle in his eye now, and all Harri could do was shake her head in disbelief and step into the briar.
"He should be properly tethered. He needs at least 3 men to hold him, not 1. This is very irresponsible, Mr. Mortimer, and if you've done this just to make a point—"
"Aye, men it needs, not a lass. A lass has no place being around livestock. So you're here now, so best get on."
He folded his arms and backed a little further away as the lad struggled and groaned, the rope growing ever tighter. Harri could feel the fear rising in her chest and anger at the risk she was being asked to take. The animal snorted loudly and looked almost as angry as she was. She fantasized about suddenly cutting the rope and standing aside, watching with great pleasure as the beast charged and flattened Mortimer to a pulp. But then something happened. She really looked at this giant animal for the first time. She looked at him with her professional eye and saw not a marauding hulk of rampage, nostril-flaring villainy, but instead she saw a very sick animal indeed. He was standing with his back arched, his neck extended and head lowered, showing a painful expression. Big, dark, terrified eyes implored her to help. She edged a little closer as the skinny lad gripped the rope tightly.
"Whoa now, easy, easy,"
she cooed. She reached out her hand very gently, careful not to make sudden movements, and then placed it on the bull's chest. She could feel the elevated respiratory rate and rummaged in her pocket for a stethoscope. His breathing pattern was highly abnormal, with an obvious abdominal component. She could see that, despite his still not inconsiderable size, he had lost weight rapidly, Loose skin hung in places where it shouldn't. He was starting to trust her now. She whispered soothing words and edged ever closer. Feeling his abdomen, a deep sadness started to form, that horrible feeling she always had when it became clear that there was no hope. The whole reason for getting into veterinary medicine wasn't to score points off crotchety old farmers or to make a stand about the rights of women. It was because she had always loved animals and wanted to make them better, to relieve suffering, to prolong and enhance their life whenever she could. But this was one of those occasions when the only way to end the suffering was to also end the animal's life. Harri swiftly conducted the rest of her examination to make absolutely sure. Then, finally convinced of the diagnosis, she stepped outside to face Mr. Mortimer and delivered the bad news. The animal would have been an expensive investment for such a small operation, and she knew that what she was about to say would be a crushing blow.
I'm sorry, truly I am, but it's a pleural abscess, a big one occupying a large portion of the chest. The kindest thing would be to...
Suddenly the old man put his head in his hands and rubbed his face nervously. Then he reached into his pocket for some tobacco. He started to stuff it into his pipe thoughtfully.
Can't you just drain it? Take it out. I've seen that done before. Cost me a pretty packet, it did, no mistake.
I'm sorry, I wish I could, but drainage of an abscess this big is rarely successful due to its size and a thick capsule wall. All it would do is cause more trauma to the animal for nothing. It gives me no pleasure to put an animal down. Believe me, if there was something I could do...
You're talking nonsense. There were naught wrong with him until the last few days.
Harri suspected this wasn't the truth. Calling out the vet was costly for these less well-off farmers, and it was often the last resort, something they resisted doing for as long as possible, especially if they suspected a woman might be turning up.
I'm afraid his condition is now very serious, and he's really suffering. Death will come eventually, and I can't see any benefit in delaying the inevitable.
Harri suddenly felt very out of her depth, standing there rubbing her hands together to stave off the cold, talking in her educated accent, both Mortimer and herself knowing she had no experience of Dale's farming, of the true impact of what she was saying. Though Mortimer wasn't indifferent to the animal's suffering, these beasts were his livelihood, and losing one of such high value without a fight wasn't an option.
I bet thee if Mr. Ross were here, he'd be recommended trying to drain it. He'd never give up. Not like you have. He'd be trying everything. That's the difference, see? He's experienced, and I want him to come out. You go away and get Mr. Ross. I'll settle for naught else.
He folded his arms tightly across his chest. Harri looked back into the briar at her patient, the lowered head and pain-stricken expression every breath a struggle. Why should the poor animal have to suffer a moment longer, waiting for another vet to come out and put him through the trauma of unnecessary surgery?
You're right, yes. Mr. Ross would try everything,
Harri replied.
And he'd charge you for it as well. You've known him long enough, Mr. Mortimer. You know no one cares more about their brass than Sterling Ross. I'll go straight away if that's what you want. I'll track him down, send him up here, and he can spend a few hours sticking in drains and poking around. His bill will be as big as that abscess. If you let me do what needs to be done, I won't charge you anything, just as we agreed. It'll be fast and painless. I'm so sorry. I really do wish it was better news. I understand what a bull like this means to a farm.
You understand nowt.
Mortimer put his pipe back in and had a thoughtful suck. Harri knew there was no point in arguing with his last statement. The snow was falling so heavily now that Harri could hardly see the old farmer. She had to keep blinking to clear her eyes. The temperature had dropped and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. Finally he pulled out his pipe and pointed it at her, shaking it vigorously to emphasize his point.
Do it then. Go on. Do what you've got to do. But I won't be paying out, and I don't want to ever see you on my land again. You understand?
Relieved she could finally do something to help her patient, Harri simply nodded in resignation and turned back towards the briar. Mortimer started to stomp back down the hillside in the direction of the farmhouse, his shoulders hunched over against the cold.
"He's a goner then, is he?"
asked the young lad, still holding the rope as Harry returned to the suffering bull.
"Afraid so. There isn't really anything I can do. I wish there was."
"Never mind old Mortimer, lass. He don't mean no harm. You just put this one out of its misery, and you've done the best you could. Sometimes it's just nature, and there's naught else you can do."
Harry smiled. How right he was, and how refreshing it was to hear it. And so, after the drama of being shot at, of seeing the world's oldest pair of long johns, of battling against cold and prejudice, Harry finally got to do a job. There in the stillness of the briar, as the snowflakes pattered softly against the roof, she ended a life. She watched as the pain and tension slipped away from her patient, listening to the laboured breathing as it slowed and then stopped completely. She ended his suffering with great care and compassion, comforted by the knowledge she had done the right thing. Not the easiest thing or the most profitable, but the right one.